3 days after her mother's funeral, Eleanor Harper found a photograph that made her question 42 years of memories. It showed her mother holding a newborn baby, but it was the words written on the back that stopped Eleanor cold. The message suggested that one day, Eleanor would discover something she was never supposed to know. She thought it was a mistake, a strange note written years ago, something she could explain away. Then she showed the photograph to her brother, and his face changed. He didn't ask what the note meant. He asked where she had found it. Her sister walked into the room moments later, heard the question Eleanor was about to ask, and suddenly became silent. That was when Eleanor realized the truth was not buried with her mother. It was still alive inside the people she had trusted most. And when she finally asked one simple question, the answer would force her to reconsider not only who her mother was, but who she had been for her entire life. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Eleanor Harper had spent 42 years believing she knew exactly who she was. She knew the house where she grew up, the woman who raised her, the siblings she fought with as a child and loved as an adult, and the countless ordinary memories that had quietly convinced her that her life made sense. Her mother, Margaret, had been there for scraped knees, school plays, birthdays, family arguments, and the difficult years that followed Eleanor's father's death. Nothing about Eleanor's childhood had ever suggested that her place in the family was uncertain. That was what made the discovery so painful. The problem wasn't that Eleanor had grown up without love. She had grown up surrounded by it. The problem was that somewhere inside that love, someone had hidden a truth so important that Eleanor had been denied the right to know it. And now, 3 days after Margaret's death, that truth was beginning to surface. Eleanor had returned to the Harper family home because she wasn't ready to let it go. Her brother Daniel had already begun sorting through their mother's belongings, while her sister Claire had started packing boxes. The house looked almost exactly as it had before Margaret died. Her favorite chair remained beside the living room window. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat on the coffee table. A mug was still sitting in the kitchen cabinet, where Margaret had kept it for decades. Everything seemed ordinary, and yet Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking through a place that had suddenly become unfamiliar. Grief can do strange things to memory. It can make ordinary objects feel sacred, while turning familiar rooms into reminders of everything that can no longer be recovered. Eleanor thought she was there to say goodbye to her childhood. She didn't know that before she left that house, she would discover something that would make her question whether her childhood had ever been exactly what she believed it was. The first clue was waiting in a drawer nobody had opened in years. The drawer was small, old, and slightly warped from years of use. Eleanor almost ignored it. It was the kind of drawer that had probably held nothing more important than receipts and old greeting cards. But when she pulled it open, it caught against something underneath. She tugged again, and a stack of envelopes shifted forward. Beneath them were photographs Eleanor had never seen before. There were pictures of Margaret as a young woman, pictures of Eleanor's father, pictures from family vacations, and several photographs from the first months after Eleanor's birth. Eleanor picked them up one at a time, studying the dates written on their backs. Then she found one that made her stop. It showed Margaret sitting in a hospital bed, exhausted but smiling, holding a newborn baby against her chest. Eleanor recognized her mother immediately. She also recognized the baby. At least, she thought she did. The photograph looked ordinary enough. What wasn't ordinary was the handwriting on the back. Eleanor turned it over, and everything inside her seemed to go still. The handwriting belonged to Margaret. Eleanor had seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, Christmas presents, and handwritten notes left on the kitchen counter. She knew every curve of those letters, but the sentence written across the back of the photograph didn't sound like anything her mother had ever said to her. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't a date. It wasn't the sentimental memory Eleanor expected to find. It was a warning. A warning written decades earlier, apparently intended for a future Eleanor Margaret had known might eventually come. Eleanor read the sentence once, then again, trying to make sense of it. The words suggested that Eleanor should never discover the truth about who she really was. For several seconds, she simply sat there on the edge of the bed with the photograph in her hands. Her first instinct was to dismiss it. Margaret had been older when she wrote it. Maybe there was context Eleanor didn't understand. Maybe the note referred to something completely unrelated. But then another thought entered her mind, one she couldn't push away. If it meant nothing, why had Margaret hidden the photograph? Eleanor spent the next several minutes searching through the drawer with a different kind of urgency. She wasn't looking for memories anymore. She was looking for answers. She found old birthday cards, medical receipts, insurance paperwork, and photographs she had never seen. She found almost nothing from the first year of her life, and that absence suddenly felt significant. There were photographs of Daniel as a baby. There were photographs of Claire as a toddler. There were family pictures from vacations and holidays. But when Eleanor searched for herself, there were only a handful of images. She remembered Margaret once telling her that those years had been difficult, and that she hadn't taken many pictures. Eleanor had accepted that explanation her entire life. Now she wondered whether there had been another reason. She placed the photographs on the bed and stared at them. 42 years of memories suddenly felt like evidence in a case she hadn't known she was part of. And for the first time, Eleanor wasn't wondering whether her mother had kept a secret. She was wondering how many people knew about it. The question followed her downstairs. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking through paperwork Margaret had left behind. He appeared tired, distracted, almost normal. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, holding the photograph against her chest. She had known her brother her entire life. She knew the way he rubbed his forehead when he was stressed. She knew how he avoided difficult conversations. She knew how he became quiet when he didn't know what to say. But what she saw when she placed the photograph on the table was different. Daniel looked at the image, and for a fraction of a second, the color seemed to leave his face. He didn't ask what Eleanor had found. He didn't ask what she wanted to know. His first concern was where the photograph had come from. That small reaction told Eleanor more than any explanation could have. He had seen it before. Or at least, he knew enough about it to be afraid of it. Eleanor watched him carefully. She had spent 42 years believing her brother was simply her older brother. Now she was studying his face, as though she had never met him before. Daniel eventually told her that their mother had kept many things during the last years of her life, and that Eleanor shouldn't assume every old note had a meaning. But he didn't explain the photograph. He didn't explain the handwriting. Most importantly, he didn't explain why he looked frightened. Eleanor pushed him again, and Daniel became defensive. He told her to leave it alone. That was the moment something changed inside her. If Daniel genuinely believed the note was meaningless, he would have said so. If he had no idea what it meant, he would have been confused. Instead, he was trying to end the conversation. Eleanor realized that whatever Margaret had hidden, Daniel wasn't discovering it with her. He was remembering it, and that left Eleanor with a question she had never imagined asking about her own family. A question that would soon force everyone else to choose between protecting the past and telling her the truth. Eleanor looked at her brother for several seconds before asking the question that had been forming in her mind since she opened the drawer. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse him. She simply asked, "Was I really born a Harper?" The question seemed to change the temperature in the room. Daniel stopped moving. His fingers tightened around the coffee cup, and for a moment he looked toward the doorway as though he expected someone else to walk in and answer for him. Then Claire appeared. She had been upstairs sorting through their mother's clothes, but the moment she heard Eleanor's question, she stopped. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at her. Neither of them looked at Eleanor. That silence lasted only a few seconds, but to Eleanor it felt endless. She had spent her entire life believing that if something important happened to her family, the people closest to her would tell her. Now her brother and sister were standing in front of her, unable to answer the simplest question about her own birth. Claire eventually asked where Eleanor had found the photograph. It was a strange response, because Eleanor hadn't asked Claire anything about the photograph. She had asked whether she was really born a Harper. That distinction wasn't lost on her. Eleanor began to understand that Claire wasn't confused. She was worried about what Eleanor had discovered. The three of them stood in the kitchen surrounded by objects that had belonged to Margaret, and suddenly, the room felt less like a family home, and more like the place where a secret had finally been exposed. Eleanor asked again. This time, she wanted an answer. Daniel told her that their mother had been under a great deal of stress toward the end of her life, and that there were things Eleanor might misunderstand if she looked at them without context. But that wasn't an answer either. Claire eventually walked away, leaving Daniel behind. Eleanor watched her go, and felt something she had never expected to feel toward her own siblings. She felt shut out. That night, Eleanor barely slept. She lay awake in the room where she had spent countless nights as a child, staring at the ceiling and replaying every strange reaction from the day. Daniel's fear, Claire's silence, The photograph, the note, the missing baby pictures. She began remembering small moments from her childhood that had never seemed important before. Once, when she was about 10, a relative had looked at her and made a comment about how different she looked from everyone else. Margaret had immediately changed the subject. Another time, Eleanor had asked why there were so few photographs from when she was a baby. Margaret had laughed and told her that those early years had been difficult and that she hadn't been good at keeping photographs. Eleanor had believed her. Now those memories were returning with a different meaning. She wondered how many clues had existed around her all along, hidden in plain sight because she had never had a reason to question them. The following morning, Eleanor went back upstairs and began searching through Margaret's paperwork. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Maybe another photograph. Maybe a letter explaining the note. Maybe something that would prove the entire thing had been a misunderstanding. Instead, she found an old folder tucked behind several insurance documents. Inside was Eleanor's birth certificate. Her name was there. Her date of birth was correct. Margaret Harper was listed as her mother. For a moment, Eleanor felt relief. She had almost convinced herself that the previous day had been nothing more than grief turning an ordinary family mystery into something larger. Then, she noticed another document underneath the birth certificate. It was older, yellowed around the edges, and marked with the name of the hospital where Eleanor had been born. She looked at the date. It was exactly the same day as her birth. She looked at the hospital. It was the same hospital. Then she saw the mother's name. It wasn't Margaret Harper. The name was Sarah Carter. Eleanor read it twice, certain she had misunderstood something. The document referred to a baby girl born on the same date Eleanor had been born. The baby's name was Rebecca Carter. Eleanor's heart began to pound. She compared the dates again. Same day, same hospital, 2 mothers, 2 baby girls. She kept searching through the folder, hoping to find an explanation, but the more documents she uncovered, the stranger the situation became. There were references to 2 separate birth records and 2 separate hospital identification numbers. Eleanor suddenly understood that this couldn't be a simple paperwork mistake made decades later. Something had happened at the hospital. Something involving 2 babies born on the same night. Then, she noticed a handwritten note at the bottom of one of the documents. It was Margaret's handwriting again. This time, the message was much shorter. It told whoever found the document that it should never have been there. Eleanor sat on the bedroom floor with the papers spread around her. She could hear Daniel moving somewhere downstairs. For a moment, she considered confronting him immediately. Then she stopped. If Daniel had already known, asking him now might only give him another opportunity to hide the truth. Eleanor needed someone outside the immediate family. Someone who had known Margaret before Eleanor was born. Someone who might tell her what her mother had refused to say. There was only one person who came to mind. Helen Brooks had been Margaret's closest friend for more than 30 years. Helen had been present at family celebrations, visited Margaret during difficult periods, and knew things about her life that even her children didn't know. Eleanor found Helen's number and stared at it for several seconds before calling. When Helen answered, Eleanor didn't tell her everything. She simply asked one question about the night she was born. The silence that followed was long enough to make Eleanor's stomach tighten. And then Helen said something that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. She told Eleanor that her mother had always been afraid this day would come. Helen's words left Eleanor silent. She had expected uncertainty, maybe confusion, perhaps even a denial. She hadn't expected Helen to already know that this moment might come. Eleanor asked what she meant, but Helen didn't answer over the phone. Instead, she asked Eleanor to come to her house. There was something in Helen's voice that made Eleanor stop arguing. Less than an hour later, Eleanor was sitting across from the woman who had known her mother for most of her adult life. Helen looked older than Eleanor remembered, but the nervousness in her face was unmistakable. She kept glancing toward an old wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. Eventually, she opened it and removed a small wooden box. She placed it between them, but didn't open it immediately. Inside that box, she explained, were things Margaret had given her years earlier. Things she had never been allowed to show Eleanor, unless Eleanor discovered the truth on her own. That sentence hurt Eleanor more than she expected. Her mother had apparently spent years preparing for a day she hoped would never arrive. Helen finally opened the box. Inside was an old hospital bracelet, several faded photographs, a handful of documents, and a sealed envelope. Eleanor stared at the items without touching them. She recognized the hospital name immediately. It was the same hospital listed on the records she had found in Margaret's bedroom. Helen explained that Margaret had given her the box nearly a decade earlier. She had told Helen that one day Eleanor might begin asking questions about her birth. Margaret had not known when it would happen, and she had hoped it never would. But she also understood that secrets rarely disappear simply because people refuse to speak about them. Eleanor picked up the hospital bracelet and noticed that the name written on it wasn't hers. It belonged to another baby. For the first time, the possibility she'd been trying to avoid became impossible to ignore. There had been another child involved in her birth, and whatever happened 42 years ago had affected two families, not just hers. Helen looked at Eleanor and finally told her that she needed to hear the truth before opening Margaret's letter. The truth was not that Eleanor had been adopted. It was much more complicated. Eleanor had been born to another woman. Her biological mother was Sarah Carter. The words seemed almost impossible to understand, because Eleanor had never known another mother. Margaret had been the woman who held her when she was sick, stayed awake when she had nightmares, celebrated her achievements, and comforted her when life became difficult. But biologically, Eleanor belonged to someone else. Helen explained that Margaret had given birth to a daughter that same night. That daughter was Rebecca. Sarah had taken Rebecca home believing she was her own child. Margaret had taken Eleanor home believing the same. The babies had been switched at the hospital because of an identification error. 6 weeks later, the hospital discovered what had happened. Eleanor struggled to breathe normally as Helen explained the sequence of events. The mistake had not been discovered immediately. For 6 weeks, two mothers had unknowingly raised each other's daughters. Eleanor had spent her first 6 weeks in Margaret's arms, while Rebecca had spent hers in Sarah's. Then the hospital discovered the records didn't match. They traced the identification bracelets, reviewed the nursery records, and eventually realized that 2 newborn girls had been sent home with the wrong families. Margaret was informed first, because she had brought Eleanor home under the assumption that she was her biological child. The hospital told her that Eleanor belonged to Sarah Carter, and that her own biological daughter was living with Sarah. Eleanor listened without interrupting. She kept looking at the hospital bracelet in her hand, as though it might somehow explain why nobody had told her sooner. But the hardest part was still ahead, because discovering that the babies had been switched was only the beginning of Margaret's secret. The real betrayal was what Margaret chose to do after she learned the truth. Margaret had been given a decision that no parent should ever have been forced to make. She could cooperate with the hospital, contact Sarah, and begin the process of returning the children to their biological families. But by then, Eleanor was no longer a stranger to her. She had already spent 6 weeks holding her, feeding her, comforting her, and watching her sleep. Margaret had bonded with the baby in her arms before she ever knew that baby wasn't biologically hers. The hospital could explain DNA, records, and identification numbers, but none of those things could erase the attachment Margaret had already developed. She knew that if she told Sarah, there was a possibility she would lose Eleanor forever. She also knew that somewhere across Columbus, another mother was raising the daughter Margaret had actually given birth to. Margaret was terrified, and instead of making the decision openly with Sarah, she made it alone. She chose to keep Eleanor. She chose silence. And that decision became the secret that would follow her family for the next 42 years. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she asked Helen how many people knew. Helen hesitated before answering. Margaret knew. Helen knew. And eventually, Daniel and Claire knew. Eleanor felt the betrayal settle differently this time. It wasn't just about her mother. It wasn't even just about the hospital. It was about the people who had sat beside her at Thanksgiving dinners, watched her celebrate birthdays, listened to her talk about her future, and allowed her to believe something they knew wasn't completely true. Daniel had known. Claire had known. They had watched Eleanor grow up without telling her that the woman she called her mother was not her biological mother. Eleanor suddenly understood why Daniel had looked afraid when she asked her question. He wasn't discovering the secret with her. He was afraid she had finally discovered what he had spent years helping to hide. Helen then pushed the sealed envelope across the table. It was addressed in Margaret's handwriting. The words on the front were simple. For Eleanor, when she knows. Eleanor stared at it for several seconds without opening it. She realized that her mother had known this day might eventually come. She had known that Eleanor might one day find the records, ask the questions, and uncover the truth. Yet Margaret had still chosen not to tell her while she was alive. Eleanor slowly reached for the envelope, her fingers trembling. She understood that whatever was inside would be the closest thing she would ever have to hearing her mother explain herself. And for the first time since finding the photograph, Eleanor wasn't asking whether her family had lied to her. She already knew they had. Now she wanted to know why. Eleanor held the envelope for several seconds before opening it. She recognized Margaret's handwriting immediately, and that recognition made the moment harder. There was something deeply painful about holding a letter written by someone who was no longer alive, knowing that whatever explanation it contained could never be followed by a conversation. Eleanor carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside. The first line began with the words, "My dearest Eleanor." She stopped there, her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she pressed the letter against her chest. She had spent the last 24 hours believing her mother had betrayed her. Yet seeing those familiar words reminded her of every birthday, every illness, every difficult night when Margaret had stayed awake beside her. The truth hadn't erased those memories. It had complicated them. Eleanor finally lowered the letter and began reading. Margaret wrote that she remembered the night Eleanor was born with painful clarity. She remembered the hospital room, the exhaustion, and the moment she first held the baby she believed was her daughter. Margaret explained that she had never known the babies had been switched when she left the hospital. For 6 weeks, she raised Eleanor believing nothing was wrong. Then one afternoon, a hospital administrator arrived at the Harper home. He told Margaret there had been an identification error, and that the baby in her home was not biologically hers. At first, Margaret refused to believe him. She demanded proof. The hospital showed her records, identification information and documentation that made the truth impossible to deny. Margaret's biological daughter was with another family. Eleanor belonged to Sarah Carter. Margaret wrote that she spent days unable to decide what to do. She thought about Sarah, a woman she had never met who was unknowingly raising Margaret's child. She thought about Rebecca, the daughter she had given birth to but never brought home. And then she thought about Eleanor. By that point, Eleanor was 6 weeks old, but to Margaret she already felt like her entire world. She couldn't imagine placing the baby in someone else's arms and walking away. Margaret knew the choice she was making was wrong, in ways she couldn't fully understand at the time. But fear became stronger than reason. She wrote that she considered contacting Sarah more than once. She imagined telling her everything and allowing the two families to correct the mistake. But every time she imagined Eleanor being taken from her, she panicked. Margaret had convinced herself that the safest thing she could do was keep the truth hidden until she could figure out what was best. Then months became years. Eleanor grew from a baby into a child, then a teenager, and eventually an adult. Every year that passed made the truth harder to reveal. Margaret told herself that telling Eleanor at 5 would only confuse her. At 15, she feared destroying her sense of identity. At 25, she believed the truth would only cause unnecessary pain. At 35, she was terrified Eleanor would hate her. Eventually, Margaret realized she had spent decades moving the moment of truth further into the future. She wasn't protecting Eleanor anymore. She was protecting herself from the consequences of a decision she had made when Eleanor was 6 weeks old. Eleanor stopped reading. That sentence stayed with her. Margaret had finally admitted something Eleanor hadn't been able to put into words. The secret had started with fear, but it had survived because of fear. Margaret was afraid of losing her daughter. Daniel and Claire were afraid of destroying the family. Helen was afraid of breaking the promise she had made to Margaret. Everyone had found a reason to remain silent. Everyone except Eleanor had been allowed to know the truth. Eleanor wiped her face and continued reading. Margaret wrote that she knew Eleanor might hate her after discovering everything. She knew Eleanor might call what she had done selfish, dishonest, or unforgivable. But there was one thing Margaret wanted her daughter to understand. She had never regretted loving her. She had never regretted the years they shared. What she regretted was taking away Eleanor's right to know where she came from. Then Margaret wrote a sentence that made Eleanor cry harder than anything else in the letter. She wrote, "You were never a mistake to me, Eleanor. The mistake was believing I had the right to keep your truth from you." Eleanor lowered the letter and stared at the floor. She had expected an excuse. She had expected Margaret to defend herself. Instead, her mother had acknowledged the betrayal. That didn't make it disappear, but it made the pain more complicated. Eleanor wanted to be angry. She was angry. But she also remembered the woman who had raised her. Margaret had loved her in every ordinary way that mattered. She had packed her lunches, stayed awake during thunderstorms, attended school events, celebrated her accomplishments, and sat beside her during heartbreak. Eleanor couldn't suddenly rewrite 42 years of love. simply because she had discovered that the foundation of her identity was different from what she believed. Yet she couldn't ignore the other truth either. There had been another woman, Sarah Carter, who had lost something that night, without even knowing what had happened. Somewhere in the same city where Eleanor had grown up, another family had spent decades living with the consequences of a mistake Margaret knew about. Eleanor turned the page, expecting the letter to explain Sarah. Instead, she found another revelation waiting for her. Margaret wrote that she had eventually learned something about Sarah that she had never forgotten. Sarah had spent years asking questions about Rebecca's birth. There had always been details that didn't seem right to her. Certain records didn't match. Certain dates raised questions. And as Rebecca grew older, Sarah noticed things that made her wonder whether the hospital had made a mistake. Margaret knew Sarah was searching for answers, but she was too afraid to approach her. She convinced herself that revealing the truth after so many years would destroy both families. Then, according to Margaret's letter, Sarah died before the truth could be fully resolved. Eleanor stared at those words in disbelief. Sarah had died without knowing that the daughter she had raised was not biologically hers. Or at least, that's what Eleanor initially believed. But then she noticed something Margaret had written in the final section of the letter. Sarah had not died completely unaware. Before her death, she had discovered enough to realize that something had happened to her daughter. She had begun searching for the truth. And according to Margaret, she had left something behind. Something that could eventually lead Eleanor to the daughter Margaret had given birth to. Her name was Rebecca. The name sat in Eleanor's mind long after she finished reading the letter. Rebecca, a woman she had never met, yet somehow the closest biological connection she had outside of the children she might have one day chosen to have herself. Rebecca was the daughter Margaret had carried, the baby whose first cry Margaret had heard, but whose childhood she had never witnessed. And Eleanor was the daughter Sarah had carried, the baby Sarah had taken home and loved, without knowing that the hospital had placed the wrong child in her arms. For 42 years, the two women had lived completely separate lives without knowing that they were sisters. Eleanor read the final pages of Margaret's letter again, looking for something she might have missed. Margaret had left a name, an old address, and a warning that the information might no longer be current. But there was one detail Eleanor couldn't ignore. Rebecca had apparently remained in the same part of Ohio for most of her life. She might still be alive. She might still be living the life Eleanor had unknowingly been supposed to share. Eleanor called Helen immediately. She needed to know whether the information in the letter was still accurate. Helen listened quietly, as Eleanor explained what she had found, then admitted that Margaret had told her about Rebecca years earlier. Helen had never met Rebecca, but she knew Margaret had occasionally searched for information about her biological daughter. She had found photographs through distant relatives, and had kept track of major events from a distance. Eleanor asked the question that had been haunting her since she read the letter. Why had Margaret never contacted Rebecca? Helen explained that Margaret had been terrified of what would happen if she entered Rebecca's life after 42 years. She feared Rebecca would hate her. She feared Sarah's family would discover what she had done. Most of all, she feared that if Eleanor learned about Rebecca, she would realize that Margaret had spent her entire life keeping two sisters separated. Eleanor felt anger rise inside her again. Margaret had been afraid of losing Eleanor, yet her decision had guaranteed that Eleanor would lose something else, the chance to know the woman who shared her blood. Eleanor spent the next several days searching for Rebecca. She didn't know exactly what she expected to find. She searched old records, public information, and family documents Margaret had kept hidden. Slowly, pieces of Rebecca's life began to emerge. She had grown up in Columbus. She had attended a local college, married young, and eventually divorced. She had a daughter of her own. She worked in education, and had apparently spent much of her adult life living a fairly ordinary life. There was nothing dramatic about her story. That was what affected Eleanor most. Rebecca hadn't been living some extraordinary hidden life. She had been somewhere nearby, waking up every morning, going to work, celebrating birthdays, making mistakes, falling in love, experiencing loss and growing older, completely unaware that another woman was living with the family she had been born into. Eleanor looked at Rebecca's photograph for a long time. The resemblance wasn't perfect, but there were details that unsettled her. The eyes were similar to hers. So was the shape of the smile. For the first time, Eleanor could see traces of herself in someone she had never known. But finding Rebecca was only half the problem. Eleanor now had to decide whether she should actually contact her. What would she say? How could she possibly explain 42 years of silence in one phone call? She considered leaving the past alone. After all, Rebecca had a life of her own. She had children who knew her as their mother, and memories built around the woman who raised her. Eleanor didn't want to walk into that life and destroy it. But then she remembered something Margaret had written in the letter. She had said that the truth belonged to Eleanor, but she had never said what Eleanor should do with it. That decision, finally, was hers. For the first time in her life, nobody else was deciding what she was allowed to know. Nobody was protecting her from the past. Nobody was choosing silence on her behalf. Eleanor picked up the phone and called the number she had found. The woman who answered didn't recognize Eleanor's voice. Eleanor almost hung up. Instead, she introduced herself and explained that she had recently lost her mother. She said she had discovered something unusual about her birth and had found a connection to the woman's family. She didn't immediately mention the word sister. She couldn't bring herself to say it. The conversation lasted only a few minutes before Eleanor realized that Rebecca was listening carefully. She agreed to meet. They chose a quiet cafe where neither of them was likely to know anyone. Eleanor arrived early and sat near the window, watching people come and go. Every time the door opened, her heart jumped. She wondered whether Rebecca would look like her. She wondered whether she would be angry. She wondered whether she would believe any of it. More than anything, she wondered what it would feel like to sit across from the woman who had unknowingly lived the life Eleanor might have lived herself. When Rebecca finally walked through the door, Eleanor recognized her almost immediately. It wasn't because they looked exactly alike. They didn't. It was something smaller and harder to explain. The way Rebecca held her bag, the expression she made when she looked around the room, even the slight tilt of her head when she noticed Eleanor. They were strangers, yet something about her felt familiar. Rebecca sat down across from her, and for several seconds neither woman spoke. Eleanor realized that every word she had prepared suddenly sounded inadequate. How could she explain that their mothers had been connected 42 years earlier by a mistake that nobody had corrected? How could she tell this woman that Margaret had given birth to her, while Sarah had raised her? How could she explain that the family photographs Rebecca had grown up with belonged, in a biological sense, to Eleanor's history too? Eleanor finally reached into her bag and placed an old photograph on the table. Rebecca looked at it. Her expression changed. Then Eleanor told her the truth. They were sisters. And the moment Rebecca understood what Eleanor was saying, 42 years of silence finally ended cries. For several seconds, Rebecca didn't react. She looked at Eleanor, then at the photograph on the table, as though she was trying to understand a sentence written in a language she had never learned. Eleanor watched the confusion move across her face. She had imagined this moment countless times since discovering the truth, but none of those imagined versions had prepared her for the reality of it. Rebecca eventually looked down at the photograph again. She recognized Margaret. She knew who the woman was, but she didn't understand why Eleanor had brought her picture. Then Eleanor explained everything. She told her about the hospital records, the 2 babies, the identification error, Margaret's letter, and the secret that had been kept for 42 years. Rebecca listened without interrupting. As Eleanor spoke, Rebecca's expression slowly changed from confusion to disbelief, then to something much harder to describe. Her entire understanding of her childhood was being rearranged in front of her. The woman she had always called her mother had loved her. That much was still true, but the woman who had given birth to her had been someone else. Rebecca's first reaction wasn't anger toward Eleanor. It was grief. She had spent her entire life believing that Sarah was her biological mother. Every childhood memory was connected to that belief. Every photograph, every birthday, every story Sarah had told her belonged to a history Rebecca had never questioned. Now she was being asked to accept that another woman had given birth to her, and that this truth had been hidden for more than 4 decades. Eleanor realized that they were experiencing the same betrayal from opposite directions. Eleanor had grown up with Margaret, and discovered that Margaret wasn't her biological mother. Rebecca had grown up with Sarah, and was learning that Sarah wasn't her biological mother. Neither woman had chosen the circumstances that separated them. Neither had known the truth, and both had lost 42 years they could never recover. They sat together for a long time, comparing memories, photographs, and fragments of information. They discovered small similarities that suddenly felt enormous. They laughed nervously at some of them. They cried over others, and slowly, 2 strangers began to understand that they had been connected all along. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and Rebecca began talking regularly. They shared stories about the women who had raised them. Eleanor told Rebecca about Margaret's stubbornness, her habit of leaving notes around the house, the way she always insisted that family dinners happen even when everyone was busy. Rebecca told Eleanor about Sarah, describing a woman who loved gardening, kept old recipes in a box, and never threw away birthday cards. The more they talked, the more they realized something painful. Their mothers had not simply been names connected to a hospital record. They were real women who had spent decades loving children they believed were theirs. Margaret had loved Eleanor. Sarah had loved Rebecca. Neither love was erased by the truth. But the truth revealed a terrible cost. Two women had unknowingly raised the wrong daughters, and when the mistake was eventually discovered, fear had prevented the families from correcting it. Eleanor began to understand that the most painful part wasn't discovering that Margaret wasn't her biological mother. It was realizing that Margaret had known and still allowed Eleanor to believe otherwise. Daniel and Claire eventually had to face Eleanor. Their explanations didn't make the betrayal disappear. They admitted that Margaret had told them years earlier. They said they had been afraid that revealing the truth would destroy their family. They had convinced themselves that because Eleanor loved Margaret and Margaret loved Eleanor, perhaps the biological truth didn't matter anymore. Eleanor understood their reasoning, but she couldn't accept it. They had decided that keeping her comfortable was more important than allowing her to make her own decision. They had taken away 42 years of choices. Eleanor could have searched for Sarah. She could have met Rebecca earlier. She could have asked questions about her medical history. She could have built a relationship with the family she came from. Instead, everyone around her had quietly agreed that she was better off not knowing. That was the part Eleanor struggled to forgive. They hadn't simply hidden a piece of family history. They had hidden a piece of Eleanor herself. Eventually, Eleanor returned to Margaret's house alone. The house had changed since the day she found the photograph. The boxes were gone. The rooms were quieter. Her mother's belongings had been divided among the children, but Eleanor had kept the old photograph and the letter. She sat in Margaret's favorite chair and read the letter one more time. For the first time, she didn't read it only as the words of the woman who had betrayed her. She read it as the words of a frightened mother who had made a decision she could never undo. Eleanor still believed Margaret had been wrong. She still believed Sarah deserved the truth. She still believed she had deserved the truth from the beginning. But she also knew something else now. The love Margaret gave her had been real. The betrayal had been real too. Those two things could exist together. Eleanor didn't have to choose one truth and erase the other. Months later, Eleanor and Rebecca stood together at the graveside where Margaret had been buried. Neither woman knew exactly what they were supposed to feel. Rebecca had lost the chance to know Margaret as a mother. Eleanor had lost the certainty she once had about the woman she called Mom. Yet standing beside Rebecca, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt since the discovery began. She felt that the missing piece of her life was finally beginning to take shape. She couldn't recover the 42 years that had been lost. She couldn't change the choices Margaret had made, or rewrite the childhood she and Rebecca had lived separately. But she could refuse to let the secret control the rest of their lives. Eleanor looked at the grave and understood that Margaret's greatest mistake had not been loving her. It had been believing that love gave her the right to decide what Eleanor deserved to know. And perhaps that was the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the people who love us most can still make choices that hurt us deeply. Love does not automatically make a decision right, and family does not always mean the people who know the truth. Sometimes, family begins when the truth finally has nowhere left to hide. Then, Eleanor had stopped asking herself whether she should forgive Margaret. She had learned that forgiveness was not a single decision that erased everything that happened. It was something she could approach in her own time, on her own terms. There were days when she felt grateful for the life Margaret had given her. There were other days when the betrayal felt impossible to accept. And then there were days when both feelings existed at the same time. Rebecca understood that better than anyone. They had become close, not because the past had suddenly become easy, but because they were the only two people who could truly understand what it meant to discover that their entire identities had been shaped by a secret they never chose. They began building a relationship slowly, without trying to force the years they had lost to disappear. They exchanged childhood photographs, met each other's families, celebrated birthdays together, and learned the small habits that sisters usually discover naturally while growing up. They couldn't go back to being children together, but they could choose not to lose the rest of their lives to the same secret. Eleanor also began to understand why her mother had left the final letter. Margaret knew she wouldn't be able to control what Eleanor felt after learning the truth. She knew Eleanor might be furious. She knew she might never forgive her. But she also knew that eventually Eleanor would need the truth more than she needed another carefully protected version of her childhood. The letter wasn't an apology that could repair 42 years. It was simply the closest Margaret could come to admitting that she had made a choice she knew she had no right to make. Eleanor kept the letter, not because it justified Margaret's actions, but because it reminded her that people are often more complicated than the worst thing they have done. Margaret had made a terrible decision. She had kept Eleanor from the truth. She had allowed fear to become a family tradition, but she had also spent 42 years loving the daughter she had raised. Eleanor eventually realized she didn't have to deny either side of that reality. The family itself never returned completely to what it had been before Margaret's death. Daniel and Claire apologized, but Eleanor knew some things couldn't be repaired simply by saying the right words. Trust had to be rebuilt, and that would take time. There were still difficult conversations. There were still moments when old memories triggered new questions, but Eleanor stopped allowing other people to decide what she could handle. For the first time, she began asking questions without apologizing for them. She learned more about Sarah's family. She learned about Margaret's history. She researched the hospital where the babies had been switched and discovered that mistakes involving newborn identification had once been a serious concern in hospitals across the country. She also learned that cases involving mistaken identities can leave families with complicated emotional consequences long after the original mistake has been discovered. What happened to her and Rebecca was deeply personal, but it also reflected something larger. How much of a person's identity can be shaped by information they never had the opportunity to question. One evening, months after the discovery, Eleanor and Rebecca sat together looking through the photographs they had collected. There were pictures of Margaret, Sarah, Daniel, Claire, Rebecca, and Eleanor at different stages of their lives. Two families had spent decades unknowingly connected by one night in a hospital. Eleanor looked at one photograph for a long time. It showed Margaret holding her as a newborn, the same photograph that had started everything. She remembered how frightened she had been when she first saw the message on the back. At the time, she believed the photograph represented a lie. Now she saw something more complicated. It represented the beginning of a life shaped by a mistake, followed by another mistake, followed by decades of silence. But it also represented a mother holding a baby she loved. Eleanor didn't excuse what Margaret had done. She simply refused to let the betrayal erase every other memory. The photograph no longer made her feel like an outsider. It reminded her that identity isn't only about blood. It's also about the people who shape us, the choices we make, and the truth we eventually decide to face. And perhaps the strangest part of Eleanor's story was that none of it began with a DNA test, a courtroom battle, or a dramatic confession. It began with one ordinary question asked inside a family kitchen. Was I really born a Harper? That question exposed a secret 4 decades old. It revealed that two sisters had grown up apart. It forced a family to confront the consequences of protecting someone from a truth they had a right to know. And it showed Eleanor something she had never understood before. Sometimes the most important questions are the ones families spend years trying to prevent us from asking. The answer may hurt. It may change the way we see people we love. It may force us to reconsider memories we once believed were permanent. But a truth discovered late is still a truth. And once Eleanor finally knew who she was, nobody else could decide what that knowledge meant for her. Today, Eleanor and Rebecca continue to build the relationship they never had as children. They don't pretend the 42 missing years can be recovered. They can't. There are birthdays they didn't celebrate together, childhood secrets they never shared, photographs that will never exist, and memories that belong to separate families. But they have stopped measuring their relationship only by what was lost. They measure it by what remains. Two women who once believed they were strangers now know they were sisters all along. Two families that were separated by a hospital mistake were eventually brought together by a question. And one woman who spent 42 years believing she knew exactly who she was, finally discovered that identity is sometimes more complicated than the story we're given. Eleanor didn't find a perfect ending. She found something more honest, the freedom to know the truth and decide for herself what to do with it. So if there is one question Eleanor's story leaves behind, it isn't simply whether Margaret was right or wrong. It is whether love can ever justify hiding someone's truth from them. Margaret believed she was protecting Eleanor. Daniel and Claire believed they were protecting their family. Helen believed she was keeping a promise. But all of them made the same mistake. They decided what Eleanor could handle without ever asking Eleanor what she wanted to know. And 42 years later, one simple question broke through all of it. Eleanor had spent most of her life believing her family story was complete. It wasn't. There had always been another chapter waiting behind the one nobody wanted her to read. Sometimes, the truth doesn't arrive when we're ready for it. Sometimes it arrives because we finally become brave enough to ask the question everyone else was hoping we would leave unanswered. And when that happens, the truth may change your story. But it also gives you something a lie never can: the chance to finally write the rest of it yourself.